scheduled then for the next half hour or so, about 25 minutes. So I think most of you are pretty well versed in meditation, so I probably don't need to say a whole lot. Maybe today, but we'll start with last week. We started with the 9-round breathing meditation. You're welcome to do that if you recall that from last week or it's something that you use regularly. Otherwise, I might just do just a short little kind of purification breathing before we begin. So just find a good meditation posture, one that works for your body, where the body is somewhat relaxed, but also has kind of an uprightness to it, an alertness. And again, we'll be working with just a single-pointed meditation over the course of this period. So if you work with the breath, then certainly just whatever way that you generally work with the breath will be fine. I usually suggest, if you don't have a way of working with the breath, to tune into the sensation in the area of the nostrils, where you feel the air coming in and out, that very subtle sensation, making that your meditation object. Just try to stay present with it as best as you can. But again, in any of our meditations on the breath or any object, we want to have that awareness, checking in occasionally, what we call our introspection, just seeing the quality of our meditation. And if we've lost the object of meditation, we've wandered away and, are thinking about various other things, distracted, what have you, then at that time we correct that, letting go of whatever it was that distracted us and bringing our awareness back to the breath. So again, what I'll suggest for you to do is the beginning here. We'll just imagine, and then I'll just do this as a short meditation before we begin. Imagine in the space before you, whatever it is that signifies for you kind of a purification. Might visualize it as white light, or you could visualize it as the Buddha, or you could visualize whatever it is that works for you in terms of a symbol of something that is pure, that is wholesome and good, the essence of everything that we're striving for in all of our practice. And set your motivation in line with that, wanting to do this meditation today to eventually achieve a state of complete purification, complete realization. And now, imagining that, again, object, person, whatever it is in the space before you that represents that purity, begin to breathe in. And we're going to take very deep, full breaths, kind of breathing in, feeling the white light from this being or this, whatever we're visualizing in front of us, enter into us, filling us all the way down to our toes, all the way to the crown of our head, filling our entire body and mind. And then as you exhale, just exhale out anything that is an obstacle for you today, as well as all the things that we've carried with us, all of our delusions, afflictions, negative states of mind, and so on. But also the fuzziness of mind we might have, or distractions that might be going on in our life currently, preoccupations, worries. Just send that all out in the form of sort of black or dark smoke that kind of goes into the space before you, and it completely disappears in the face of this white visualization in front of us, or the Buddha in front of us, whatever it is that you're visualizing. So just take a couple of breaths like that, breathing in all the purifying, bright energy of that being or object in front of you, and then breathing out whatever are obstacles that melt in the face of that being before us. And taking very deep breaths, breathe in again. Filling your entire body and mind, and then breathing out whatever is an obstacle for you. Let's do one more breath. Breathing in again very deeply, filling your entire being with that brilliant light, brilliant energy. And then breathing out, again, all of what obscures our minds, all of our problems, worries, and so on. So you're welcome to continue to do that a little bit, or again, to do whatever purification through the 9-round breathing or what have you. But otherwise, I'll ring the chime and we'll just go into our meditation period, working with the breath as best as you can for the next 20 minutes or so. Okay, and then just have a thought or two about dedicating. Dedicating is sealing all this positive energy we've created by spending some time in concentration, thinking, may this become the cause for both the fulfillment of our own welfare, but especially for the fulfillment of the welfare of all beings, dedicating it in that way. Okay, so we have about a 5-minute break until we begin the class. So I will see you shortly. Thank you for joining for the meditation. So let's go ahead and start today with just a few prayers. I think it's nice to do at least, well, probably just do one prayer, which is the Refuge and Bodhicitta prayer, again, which is a standard prayer, kind of sets our mind in the right direction in terms of why we're here, renewing our sense of refuge or safe direction that we find in the Buddha's teachings in particular. And then also generating this mind of bodhicitta that we'll meditate on shortly. So that's the prayer that's on the right-hand side of the screen right now. Again, we'll do this, I think just do it 3 times in English today, and just bring the thoughts that are encapsulated in that to mind as we recite these words together. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create by listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merit I create by listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merit I create by listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Good. Let's go ahead and start then with a short meditation. We just did a little period of meditation, but give all of us a chance to have a few minutes of focused meditation using the breath as our object. So if you need a suggestion in terms of how to work with the breath, you can focus in on that sensation in the area of the nostrils. That's a good one to work with, the sensation that occurs in that area when you're inhaling and exhaling through the nose. And making that your object, just try to stay present with it as best as you can. Whenever the mind wanders away from that and we see that that's happened, then we just gently let go of that and return to the breath. And if you have another technique that you want to use with the breath, you're welcome to do that. So I will ring the chime here, and we'll start just a short period in silence on the breath, and then I'll lead you in a short reflection to introduce today's topic as well as to set our motivation. So now let's do a short investigation of this topic for today, working with overcoming our pride and how we offset that with the mind of humility. And then we'll funnel that into generating a good motivation for being here. But I'd like you to just spend a minute or two examining your own experience with this delusion we call pride. We use pride in a lot of different ways in our culture, but here we're talking about a very harmful mind. A mind that has the tendency to look upon whatever it is that we possess, maybe our possessions, wealth, uh, our standing in society, but especially on the spiritual path, our understanding, the degree to which we engage in our practice, we can even become prideful around that. But this is a mind that inflates and exaggerates those things. It's often comparing ourselves to others and thinking that we're so much better. It's a feeling of superiority. So think about this in terms of especially your spiritual practice. Where has pride been problematic for you? If it has, just try to be honestly examining your own experience around that state of mind, that puffing up, thinking that we're so much greater than we actually are. Just spend a minute or so examining that. And then let's look at the opposite state of mind that we'll be working with today, this mind of humility. Every one of us also has experience with that state of mind to some degree, kind of being in that place of sort of having freedom from that arrogance, abiding in a state of contentment, not being bothered, not being sort of caught up in that comparison. And what are your own experiences around practicing this mind of humility, being humble, lacking pretentiousness, just kind of being content? And spend a minute or so looking at that, because it's important that we also acknowledge how we do have that mind in our lives already. And then moreover, I'd like you to just briefly examine what were the effects of having that mind compared to having the mind of pride. And did it lead to a greater peace of mind in terms of how we go about our lives, how we interact with others? Can you see some of the benefits of having this mind of humility compared to what happens when we live our lives with that inflated sense of ego, that sense of self that is conceited, prideful, and so on? Just take a moment to kind of really assess the advantages of having that state of mind of humility. And then let's channel this into our motivation for being here. So every one of us, again, has both of these states of mind to some degree. And we ideally want to move towards having a greater sense of humility, what I'm calling genuine humility. And so set that motivation that you, through this investigation, no doubt have already seen the benefits of having that state of mind, how it leads to greater peace of mind, connection with others, and generate that strong intention to be here to continue the examination of this state of mind of humility as a way of combating our pride. And to do that work initially for yourself, because you can see the benefits it has upon your own experience. But moreover, because this is something that plays out in our relationship with others, let's make that motivation of doing this work for the sake of others as well, the beings in our lives who we interact with, so that we can have more peaceful, harmonious, complementary relationships with others, so that we can help them and achieve the greater welfare of all sentient beings through this work. This is ideally this motivation of bodhicitta, this strong wish to develop ourselves fully, to be free of our pride and all of our other distorted states of mind, and to develop our humility and all the positive qualities, so that we can eventually help all sentient beings to do that same work, and hold that strong intention for being here today. Okay, good. So I'm appreciative of the offer to teach on this topic. Sometimes I introduce these talks by saying a lot of the talks that I do for a lot of the centers I visit now, virtually or in person, when that was happening, are based on some talks I did here in Santa Fe at our center, Tupten Norbuling, back in 2007, 2008. I was wanting to branch out a little bit, having gone to the master's program over in Italy. It's very, classical, traditional way of approaching things, and you learn all of the sort of ins and outs of things, but how does that really manifest in terms of everyday life? And so this topic of overcoming pride with genuine humility, it's not a topic that gets a whole lot of airtime in Buddhism. Nonetheless, pride is singled out, as we're going to see in the slides I'm going to show you shortly. It's singled out as one of what are called the six root afflictions, these six distorted states of mind that are said to be kind of at the core of so many of our problems. Of course, when Buddhism is approaching that idea, it's approaching it from the point of view of our spiritual development. And this is really where we see some of the biggest detriments to our pride, is that it becomes a huge block in terms of our ability to advance, to really take the teachings to heart, and to do what we can to develop ourselves. And I think, when I had you examine these two states of mind, pride and humility, and my own experience is that sometimes, we kind of go along and everything seems to be going well and we seem to be doing quite well, and we get very prideful. And then, of course, what do they say? Pride always comes before a fall. Then something happens, and maybe even somebody points out to us some fault or flaw, something that we're not doing quite right, or some defect in our character, and we immediately go to the depths of total self-denigration. We just think we're worthless. You might as well throw us in the trash bin. There's no value to us whatsoever. So we kind of vacillate between these two extremes, and we don't find this kind of middle way again, this balanced approach to how we can really be genuinely humble, how we can be with others from that place of a contentment with ourselves, embracing both sides of it. Because the spiritual path is also not one where we totally neglect what we have accomplished. We do need to take some delight in that, and to really admire the ways that we have developed ourselves. But we also don't need to go to the extreme of being totally caught up then in all of our faults and flaws. They have that saying that if 10 people out of 10 people, if 9 of them all say that you're a wonderful person and one person says that you're awful, who do you listen to? You listen to that one person, and you get totally caught up in that. you know And so again, how do you have a humility that is able to embrace this wide array of things, that we're not going to, again, meet everybody's needs. We're not going to be perfect for everybody. We're not even going to be perfect in our own eyes for quite some time. But how do we embrace sort of both sides of it, our faults, the lack of qualities, and the qualities that we have attained, and find this sort of middle way between these? So this is what I'm going to be talking about today. Again, hopefully it'll be of some use. This is, again, I think an affliction, a distorted state of mind that we have that we don't really talk about that much. In the traditional teachings, it is singled out, as I said, and there usually is some advice given, and I will go through some of that. But I'm also going to talk about it in other more general terms, using a couple of different sources that I think are quite useful. So let's dive into the slides that I put together for this. Let me put it on a slideshow here. Got a nice pink background there. It's a little bit on the bright side. Wake you up this morning. Whoops, whoops, whoops. I don't know how it did that. These are the three topics that I've sort of divided today's lecture into, and then we'll approach it from the point of view of these three main things. First is to really get in there and understand what pride is. Kind of get our hands dirty by looking at this afflicted state of mind, what it does, its functions, the faults of having that pride, which we can already be aware of to a large degree, as well as in traditional teachings, they talk about the types of pride. There are actually 7 types of pride, and there's even another one that is in a different presentation that I'm going to introduce you to. It won't be on the slides, but nonetheless, it's pride can have many different facets and features to it. Then we're going to go through humility and its attributes, kind of really understand what that mind is all about. And then talk a little bit about a couple of steps, things that can help us, different instruction that can help us to develop genuine humility. Again, some of it from the more traditional teachings, but also some of it, again, from just working with our minds in general, and how we can see that certain things will be useful to embody that state of humility. So this is the definition that's given of pride in the traditional text, and what's called lorik. Lorik means essentially mind and cognition. It's the general study of the mind that's done in our tradition. I think I know Venerable Tendrin's very well trained in that due to her studying the basic program in Australia. I don't know if she's taught it there, but it's a wonderful thing to engage in, to kind of pick apart our minds and understand the inventory in our minds. Or as Venerable Rabin often talks about, get to know your crazy neighbors, your crazy roommates, I think is actually the word she used, crazy roommates. Like we're living in this mind with all of these various things that kind of come to the forefront at various times. And so pride is one of them. That's one of these crazy roommates that we have to get to know it well. Because if we don't know it well, then we won't see it as a problematic state of mind. So pride has the aspect of a puffing up of the mind upon observing one's own wealth, qualities, youth, and so forth. I mean, there's no end to the number of things that we could be prideful about. So in terms of this idea of puffing up, it was kind of interesting. Geshe Sopa, who's written an extensive commentary on the stages of the path, and his little section talking about pride, he says it's like puffing up like a balloon. But what is inside a balloon? There's mostly just hot air, or it's certainly just air, so there's not really a whole lot of substance to the balloon. It's sort of an inflation of everything on the basis of not having what is commensurate with that inside of it. So again, he even uses the idea that we're supposed to sort of deflate this balloon of all of the hot air of pride and fill it up with the cool air of wisdom, that is actually able to do something meaningful with our minds. But this idea of puffing up, it's kind of an interesting way to describe it. This is not a very technical term, but it's that inflation, that idea that we kind of go beyond what is there, kind of looking at our various qualities, possessions, whatever it is that we have in life, our social standing, our fame, and we embellish that to a large degree, exaggerate that, inflate beyond what is there, and then we hold on to this inflated view of ourselves, this puffed up idea of who we are. So this is the problem of it, is that it's not really a very truthful mind. Of course, none of the delusions or afflictions are truthful minds. So in the second bullet point there, it says it's one, I mentioned this earlier, one of the 6 root afflictions or delusions, along with, these are the other ones just so you know them, and I might be talking about a few of them, especially within that last three: afflicted doubt, afflicted views, and the three root poisons of attachment, anger, and ignorance. So it's interesting again that these are singled out. Of course, the three root poisons, most of you are familiar with this from your previous Buddhist studies. These are sort of our habitual way of kind of our default dealing with things. Let me talk about those just a moment, because I think it is important, since some of them do definitely play a role in terms of pride arising. So these three root delusions, the biggest one of these three, the source of all of the other delusions, is a deeper state of ignorance. Ignorance can be a variety of things, right? We can be ignorant of a number of things of knowledge in the world. And of course, the teachings I've been doing on Thursday night on karma. Karma, of course, is one of the topics that you can have some ignorance around, not being aware that the actions that we do have their consequences in terms of the experiences that come from those. So that's a coarser level of ignorance, and one that we also need to overcome. But here we're talking about this subtler level of ignorance, what I'm dealing with in my teachings on Tuesday night and looking at the Heart Sutra, kind of this sense of self that we're grasping onto. Of course, we grasp onto that with regard to everything, thinking that everything has some sort of inherent identity, that it is established out there on its own. But we do that with regard to the self. We think that this I is this concrete, independent I existing here, and it doesn't exist that way at all. So when we have everything rooted in this distorted state of mind, everything that comes up above that, our attachment and aversion or anger, as well as pride and all the other states of mind that we call delusions or afflictions, they're all tainted with that ignorance. They're all arising together with that ignorance. They're all incorrect minds. And of course, this is the basis for why the Buddha says that we can purify our minds, is because all those things that are rooted in ignorance, rooted in not knowing and misknowing the way things exist, can be undermined by wisdom, by understanding how things actually exist. So pride is kind of an interesting one. Again, it's set up as one of these six root afflictions because it does have its effect on our spiritual practice, but essentially it is rooted in the three root delusions. It's rooted, of course, in our ignorance, but I see it very much akin to the mind of attachment. Attachment and anger are sort of our distorted responses to getting what we want and not getting what we want. Which are essentially all the pleasant experiences, all the delicious, delightful things we have in our lives, the things we love to have and think about and experience. All of those, we develop a strong sense of attachment to them, a desire to be with them. And of course, the mind of attachment is also this type of exaggeration, just like pride is. Pride, again, is taking what we have, whatever qualities we possess, whatever wealth we have, and thinking it's so much greater, thinking and having and imbuing it with that sense of superiority. Well, the mind of attachment is doing the same thing with regard to these pleasant objects. We experience something that we get some sort of pleasant feeling from, and we paint the entire picture pleasant, and we want to be with that, and we don't want to be separated from that. So I see, pride, and traditionally it is taught that pride is sort of an extension of the mind of attachment, where we get attached to that sense of I that is at the center of all this and raise it up to this level of superiority, inflate it to an even greater degree. We're even going to see this in one of the 7 types of pride that is accentuating that sense of I that is at the core of all of this, that is the most problematic state of mind. So of course, then just to touch on briefly the other of the three root poisons. So we have ignorance at the root, we have attachment when we get what's pleasant, we have anger or aversion when we get what's unpleasant. That's of course that reaction when attachment doesn't get what it wants, when we have things that we have to face in our lives. And of course, pride maybe has some flavor of that to some degree when we are annoyed by somebody else's possessing of things, having qualities that we don't possess. Somebody who's always got the answer to the question, who always knows things that we don't know. We might get upset and angry at that, and our prideful mind might latch on to what we do have and think we're still superior, think we're still much more than them, even though they've already shown themselves to have greater qualities or knowledge than we possess. So anger can probably play a little bit of a role, but I mostly see pride again as this mind of attachment manifesting in this very problematic way. And even when we look at those were the three root poisons that are part of the 6 root afflictions. Look at the other three. We had pride, afflicted views, and afflicted doubt. Those are also huge obstacles on our path. You know, when Buddhist psychology was put together, when this whole list, there's actually said to be 51 mental factors. These 6 are one grouping, which are called the 6 root afflictions. There are then 20 secondary afflictions. But these are kind of a way of doing kind of inventory of our minds in the context of our spiritual practice. And of course, that's why I'm emphasizing this whole thing, in today's talk, is that pride is problematic because, like afflicted doubt, like afflicted views, like the 3 root poisons, are the greatest obstacles to our spiritual development. What keeps us moving forward and actually achieving realizations, actually being a benefit to others, and so on. So it is important, again, when we talk about these 6 root afflictions that pride is a part of, to know that we are talking about, in terms of this mind of pride, something that is distorted, something that is rooted in ignorance, something that is harmful to us, that produces suffering. So let's go back to the slides and continue this sort of investigation of what pride is all about. Excuse me. So, like all our afflictions, pride has the root of ignorance, particularly the strong clinging to a false sense of I. Of course, again, this is what we learn, what we're going into on Tuesday night, is that we need to investigate and come to see that this is the object of that ignorance, a false object. Therefore, it is not true. Therefore, it can be undermined. But as I just mentioned, it can also be seen to have the flavor of attachment, since it arises in conjunction with a quality or an object that we possess, which we then exaggerate greatly. We make it superior to everyone else. We think we're the best in the room in terms of whatever it is that pride is latching onto and embellishing. So in terms of where pride comes from, unlike self-confidence and self-esteem, which can be beneficial in our lives and our spiritual practice, pride arises as a distorted sense of self-importance. This idea that, again, it's not a helpful state of mind. It's not actually like those minds that I've identified here, having self-confidence, self-esteem. These are definitely needed in all of our endeavors, whether we're talking about our spiritual endeavors or our worldly endeavors. We need to think good of ourselves. I mentioned it earlier on in the talk, how this is sometimes the problem, right, is that we have to find this balance, where we can include in there a healthy sense of self-esteem, good self-regard, so that we can go about our spiritual path with some confidence that we can achieve these things. But it's a tricky balance again, and sometimes the minute that we start focusing on all that, pride starts to creep in and we think we're so much better than we actually are, and then once more we get humbled by something that we recognize, and we go to the pits, we go to the depths of despair and think that we're nothing then, that we don't have any qualities at all. So a good sense of self-confidence, high self-esteem, these are important qualities to have, and they are not what we mean by pride at all. Pride is coming from that place of self-importance where we do tend to think of ourselves primarily. It's a mind that is very self-centered, and we elevate ourselves to that degree, thinking that what we possess, the qualities we have, are therefore so much greater than what we actually possess. And again, that self-importance is frequently even used as a synonym for pride in some of the teachings on these delusions. And it's a nice word, thinking that of ourselves in that important way. We're a VIP to ourselves. And so we think that we need to be seen as a VIP by everyone else then, in terms of whatever it is that we're prideful of. Again, in the spiritual path primarily, our knowledge, our level of practice, what have you. I find this an interesting comment that I wanted to share with you as well, though, and it comes from the Book of Joy by His Holiness the Dalai Lama, as well as Archbishop Desmond Tutu, a dialogue that they had that was sort of put down into this book by Douglas Abrams, a third party who was there present at these dialogues. It took place about 5 years ago in Dharamsala, India. And they use humility as one of what they call the 8 pillars of joy. And in that, in kind of looking at pride and how it's the opposite of that humility, the comment is made that true arrogance really comes from insecurity. Needing to feel that we are bigger than others comes from a nagging fear that we are smaller. So once more, that's where that kind of, we talked about attachment playing a role, but that's where that kind of aversion or anger energy plays a role too, right? We see others and we think that, they have so much greater qualities than we have. They've been studying the Dharma, for example, less than we have. They've only been here at the center for a year. And look at how much knowledge they have and how much greater they are in their understanding. And I've been here for 10 years or whatever. And so we become kind of prideful on the basis of feeling that sense of insecurity. We don't like being with ourselves in that way of comparing ourselves and thinking we're deficient. And so instead of being okay with that deficiency and working on, making up for it by doing much more study and what have you, we become prideful. We latch onto the things that we do have knowledge of, and we think that they're so much greater. We puff all of that up. So I like this comment because I think there's a lot of truth to it, that pride actually comes from a deep sense of insecurity. We look at the society that we live in, and no doubt we can identify some people who are larger figures in our world right now who we can see embody some of that pride or arrogance, that sense of conceit. And it's very painful if we actually see it through that lens of recognizing that that's actually coming from a place of very deep-rooted insecurity, not wanting to be exposed for the sort of charlatan that they are, for the fake that they are, because they've just filled the balloon with air. They've just done what they could to inflate this sense of ego, and there's really nothing there. There's really no substance there to it. And again, I'm not trying to be critical of those people. It's something that, again, it is useful sometimes to look at others and see them as a mirror for what it is we need to see in ourselves. But once more, don't become latching onto that and make that into your pastime, trying to find pride in everyone else. That's not the goal of our Buddhist practice, is to see how prideful everyone else is and all their insecurities and why they are prideful. It's to see it in regard to ourselves. It's the most important thing about the teachings is, they say, don't take it personal. Well, in Buddhist teachings, I think everything's meant to be taken personal to some degree, not in maybe the ways that sometimes that's thought of, but we are meant to be taking it as personal advice. We are meant to be looking at this and saying, okay, how do I look at my own pride when I see it mirrored in another? And many teachers I've had have said that if you can see an affliction in another person, that means that you have it yourself. So don't start picking out their faults and flaws when you yourself have that. So I think it is important, again, that we use these examples we see in the world around us, or how we see pride arises in certain people, as a way of mirroring that within our own understanding and our own work. Let's look at what pride does. What is its function? Traditionally, it's said to have the function of serving as the basis for the arising of disrespect and suffering. Of course, disrespect because, as it says there, we think ourselves better than others, and so therefore we think we are deserving of being the object of respect of others, and we don't respect them, therefore. Because we're setting ourselves up as, the one that's in charge. I think even the literal translation of pride is I king, capital I king, or ruler, queen, whatever. Somebody who is kind of thinking we're the ones that are deserving of all that respect. The I is king. The I is on the throne. The I is what needs to be prostrated to and honored and, offered to and what have you. So we end up disrespecting other people, which of course creates all kinds of problems. We don't connect with them in a very genuine and heartfelt way. Instead, we're always relating to others from that place of feeling superior. It also, of course, has the basis, or serves as the basis for the arising of suffering. Why suffering? Because the prideful mind can be a factor in many of our non-virtuous actions, thus leading us to not have peace in this life, which is how the afflictions all torment us right now. But also, afflictions cause us to engage in actions, create karma for future suffering. So certainly this is true for all of the delusions. They're all involved in creating our suffering to some degree. But pride, again, can be a source of motivation for other actions, where we are looking at ourselves as being so much greater, and therefore we have no problem saying negative things to others, putting them down, speaking harshly to them, and so on. Excuse me for just a moment. I'm going to need to take a drink of water here. Okay, so these are the traditional functions of pride, kind of what it serves to do. I've put together a short list of some of the other faults of pride, some of the things that arise on the basis of our pride that can be problematic in our spiritual practice. No doubt you have other things that you've seen in your own experience around pride. And if you want to share any of those in the chat box, you're welcome to do so. But certainly, if we have a really strong pride and an inflation of our own sense of self, it can cause us to disregard the advice of teachers. When we're hearing something from a teacher and we think that we know better than them, or that we know more than them, or that we have better understanding of things than them, well, then the things that they're telling us, we'll take it with a grain of salt. We won't really take it seriously. We won't really follow the advice that they're giving us, which, of course, in this tradition, we do depend upon our teachers greatly. They are the ones who are pointing the way for us, helping us to pay attention to things. If a teacher points out your faults, which can sometimes happen, you know, I'm not the best person at doing that as a teacher myself, but many teachers in our tradition are very good at like picking things out, even when someone's asking a question, trying to get at what it is that they are, asking from, what's the state of mind behind that. I mean, one I'm bringing to mind in particular is one of my dear teachers, Venerable Rabina. I remember when I first started attending her teachings in California, in San Francisco, when I first started my Dharma practice, there was a friend of mine who would ask questions, and Venerable Rabina wouldn't answer her questions. She would just say, just listen to yourself. Just listen to yourself. That was all she would say. And so the poor student, was trying to figure out what to ask, but, Venerable Rabina kept saying, just listen to yourself. Listen to the thoughts and why you're asking that question, what's behind that question. We have to be willing to kind of do that work. But of course, if someone's not willing to take that in and say, oh, she's telling me I need to do some deeper investigation. If they think, oh, this teacher doesn't know anything, they're not even answering my questions, and they get kind of prideful around that, well, that becomes a huge block to taking advantage of what teachers have to offer. And every teacher has something to offer, something that we can, learn from. As we're going to learn today, every person has something to offer to us, a lesson that they can help us with. Of course, it creates a tense and hostile atmosphere with others. If you yourself are plagued by great pride, examine your own relationship with others. But if you've worked in a place or been involved in a place where somebody is very prideful, we can see that there's a tension there sometimes. Oftentimes you don't want to rock the boat then, because that person thinks so much of themselves that anything you say that can appear critical could be taken in a very hostile way. It also, of course, one of the big ones, it blocks our compassion and loving kindness. I mean, how can we have a genuine caring and concern for the suffering of others and for their happiness if we don't see them in an equal light, if we're always thinking we're superior to them? It's kind of interesting in the traditional teachings on compassion. They often talk about for the four immeasurables: compassion, loving kindness, joy, and equanimity. They talk about the near enemies and the far enemies, kind of the minds that are near to that could be mistaken for that, whereas the far enemies are quite clearly identifiable as such. So for compassion, for example, the far enemy, of course, is cruelty, where we can harm somebody with no regard, But the near enemy of compassion is actually pity. Well, what is the mind that is behind pity? It's the prideful mind. It's the mind of superiority, where we can look down on other sentient beings, and say, oh, you poor sentient beings, you're all suffering there. I feel bad for you. I wish you weren't suffering. But you're doing it from a place of feeling like you're above the fray. You're not, that's not you down there. That couldn't be you down there. You're so much better than that. I mean, that's how pity manifests. And pity is not compassion, but it could be mistaken for compassion. So in terms of blocking our compassion, it can manifest that way, that we have this looking down on others and we can't possibly be on the same level as them, or even hold them to be more important in terms of relieving their suffering, helping them to be happy. So again, a lot of the things we're trying to achieve on our spiritual path, deepening our connection to others through compassion and loving kindness, can be blocked if we have this prideful mind. And then it has also the fault of agitating our mind with constant judgment and comparison with others. The prideful mind is one that is, of course, not content. It is like this king or ruler, in that it's constantly concerned about the kingdoms around oneself and making sure that they aren't threatening to oneself, and always judging others and comparing ourselves with others. My gosh, how much energy and time does the prideful mind put into those types of activities that we could be spending engaged in so much more beneficial states of mind? Compassion and loving kindness, for example. Instead of looking at others and constantly judging them, putting them down mentally, comparing ourselves with them, think about, their good qualities, or embrace thoughts of loving kindness and compassion to them. So we see, again, these are some of the faults of pride. Maybe I'll actually stop it here and see if anyone has anything they'd like to share in this regard from your own experiences around pride, anything that you've seen as a harmful effect of pride, one of the things that it manifests for you. Anyone? Yes, Tal. Did you need to be unmuted? Whoops. I'm not hearing you. Whoops. It keeps going back and forth. Okay. Please tell.
A lot of people go around very focused on their deficiencies, and I'm wondering if, I know that that is a kind of self-grasping, so is that also considered a form of pride?
Well, again, we have to look at the motivation behind that, and there is, when we get into the types of pride, if you're talking about somebody who really just, kind of identifies with all of that and almost puts themselves lower than everyone else, that can become a problematic mind as well. But nonetheless, I mean, again, when we go back to what I said initially, that this idea that pride kind of takes our qualities up, puts them all up here, thinking that they're so much more elevated than they are. When we start to develop some level of humility, we can sometimes mistake that for being totally identified with the deficiencies and the faults, so that we end up with an ego that's down here and we don't find that kind of middle way again. So it really depends. We have to be cognizant of our deficiencies. The spiritual path is one where we shouldn't neglect that, because otherwise, well, that's a form of ignorance as well, right? We live our lives thinking, oh, these teachers are all talking about all these delusions. Well, I don't have any of those. Those aren't problems for me. Well, they're problems for all of us. We all deal with those, standard states of mind that are problematic. So if we have kind of a total neglect of our deficiencies, that's not going to be useful in our spiritual path either. But if we have a total identification with them and we go plummeting into that place of thinking, I have no qualities at all, I'm worthless, well, then that's not going to be fruitful in terms of our spiritual endeavors either, because we need, again, a healthy sense of self-confidence to kind of look at the work that we've already done, the ways that we've already begun to address this, and rejoice in those, be happy at those, but also acknowledge the work that still needs to be done. Did that kind of address it a little bit, Tal? Is there any good quality in pride? I'm getting a question on the chat box. Well, if we're talking about pride as this delusion, we would say no. Again, when we talk about, in our culture, we use pride in different ways, though, right? Like we take pride in something we've accomplished. And even in our spiritual path, we might say that, oh, I completed 3 Nyungne retreats. So if you've never done a Nyungne retreat, it's a little bit of an ordeal. If, it's a bit physically challenging, it's a wonderful retreat. But nonetheless, you can feel some sense of pride at having done that. Well, if it's simply just that acknowledgement that you have done something good and a feeling good about that, a sort of joy, inner joy that you take on the basis of that, I think that's perfectly fine. And that is actually how we feed our spiritual progress, is by acknowledging the work that we do. So if we're using pride in that more general, kind of colloquial way, that's okay. Here we're talking about the pride that is an affliction. And as an affliction, it doesn't really serve any purpose, because it takes us out of the realm of where we need to be. As we were saying, looking at those faults, those are the exact opposite then of where we want to be. We want to be at a level where we can connect with others genuinely, where we can be aware of our own deficiencies and lack of practice and continue to address those, where we don't distort things so that people think more of us than what we actually are. Where we are very genuine, honest, and so on. We're going to get into this when we look at what humility looks like. But in answer to your question, if we're talking about the afflicted sense of pride, it really never serves any purpose. Now, there is even the use of the word pride much later in spiritual practice in the Tibetan Buddhist path in the context of Tantra. Tantra, of course, most of what we study and all that I'm presenting today is in the context of what we would call sutra, or the more common general teachings that the Buddha gave. He also gave what are more esoteric teachings that were designed specifically for bodhisattvas, great practitioners who could use some of the energies of these delusions on the spiritual path. But nonetheless, he uses the concept of pride on the tantric path, in that Tantra is about thinking of oneself as a Buddha right now. Well, you need a great sense of what's called divine pride or deity pride. You need to kind of think of yourself at that elevated state of being a Buddha right now without it becoming delusional, without it becoming afflicted. So pride is even used in that sense in a more wholesome way. So there are select uses of the word pride that can be more virtuous. But whenever we're talking about pride here as a delusion, we're talking about, again, this inflation, this puffing up of the mind, kind of something that is bigger than what is actually there. There's another question. What about the 8 verses of training the mind? We view ourselves alone. That's going to come up in just a few slides, Anthony. We'll talk about that. Yeah, and get an understanding of that. Because I think, again, they can be misunderstood. So hold on to that. That's a great segue into what we're going to be looking at here. So let's continue on then. We're going to get into these 7 types of pride. I'm going to go through this rather quickly because, again, we've got lots more important stuff to talk about in terms of humility. But I really want to make sure that you get these first 3, because this shows the gradations of how this afflicted pride can take place. Pride, the very first one, which is your general run-of-the-mill pride, is a puffing up of the mind, thinking that one is superior to lower persons. So here, you're looking at it from the point of view, okay, I do have certain qualities or possessions or things that are superior to some people. So I'm going to feel prideful about that, which is already kind of silly because you don't even know the other qualities or possessions or whatever that person might have. They might be a richer person in many ways, in other ways than what you are. And nonetheless, we have a prideful mind, even in the context of something where we can see there's evidence that we are superior. Excessive pride is a puffing up of the mind, thinking that one is superior to equal persons. So this is where we look at people who, in general, I mean, maybe you have a coworker who's been there as long as you, who's doing the same job as you, who is equally knowledgeable as you, but you think you're so much better than them. Then we have the third one, whereas pride gets kind of even, the balloon is even bigger at this point. Pride beyond pride, a puffing up of the mind, thinking that one is greatly superior, even to persons who are superior to oneself. So here, there's somebody in your trade or your profession who's been around a lot longer, who obviously has much greater skill and capability than you, but you think you're so much better than them. You have a prideful mind. So we can see that, this prideful mind, this third one, is quite distorted. The second one is still, distorted, but even the first one has some level of distortion. Even if there's evidence that the person is inferior to us in regard to certain qualities, that still is not a mind that is honest with regard to everything about that person. We may not understand everything that they are about, and instead we're focusing on one thing and we're thinking we're so much better than they are. So you can see how even in these first 3, pride gets bigger and bigger, the balloon, again, expanding. The next 2 are pride thinking of I, as I mentioned. This is singled out as a particular form of pride, which is the puffing up of the mind, observing this sort of body-mind complex and thinking I, where we develop some sense of pride just on the basis of who we are, just on this sense of I that we cling to so tightly. As I said, that's the underwriting ignorance that is behind pride, but here it's almost kind of coming to the forefront and elevating in a real genuine sense of self-importance, that I am what matters, me, myself, and I. Then there's the pride of conceit, a puffing up of the mind, thinking that one has attained what one has not attained. They actually say that you can develop certain clairvoyances, insights, clear seeing into various phenomena that you are not able to access in general. And you do that through meditative stabilizations, but we might think that we've developed some great abilities that we actually haven't. That's a pride of conceit around those particular accomplishments. There's also, this is an interesting one, the pride of slight inferiority, a puffing up of the mind, thinking one is just a little lower than others who are actually greatly superior. So you're kind of like, looking at the Dalai Lama and thinking, oh, I'm almost as knowledgeable and compassionate as the Dalai Lama is. I'm pretty close to that, but he's a little higher than me. Well, you're acknowledging his superiority in terms of those qualities, but you're thinking you're so much closer to that than what you actually are. I mean, I'm saying this about myself. I'm certainly nowhere near the Dalai Lama's qualities. Then there's wrongful pride, a puffing up of the mind, thinking that one has attained auspicious qualities when one has actually deviated from the path. So you become prideful in your spiritual practice, thinking that you've actually attained such great things, but it's all based on wrong knowledge. It's actually deviation from the path. It's interesting, I said earlier I was going to introduce one variation on pride that isn't in this list of 7 that's in our traditional texts we study in this organization. But it's a form of pride that is actually taking pride in our humility. And I've actually seen some people manifesting this, and of course I have to watch myself sometimes to make sure that I'm not doing that. Sometimes we get into playing the humble role, and maybe this was a bit of what Tal was talking about too, where we kind of start clinging to that sense of our deficiencies or bringing ourselves to a lower position. Even what Anthony's referring to that we're going to get into in regard to this verse that's coming up that I'm going to share about humility, where we start identifying with being the lowest of all, where we feel like we are the stuff under the shoes of everybody else. We're the dirt under their shoes, whatever. And everyone else is so much greater than us. And we almost take this sort of sense of pride in our humility. Well, how can that be humility then? That's a distortion even of humility, where we are clinging to some deficient view of ourselves and elevating it to being the humblest person in the room. I don't know. It's an interesting take on it. So we have to be careful again with these gradations of pride and see that pride can manifest in a variety of ways in response to particular, phenomena. Let's go on to humility, because again, that's the main thing we want to get into today, is to really see how we embrace this state of mind and what the state of mind is all about. Because as we just saw, even in looking at that last one that I introduced, that false sense of pride on the basis of our humility, that can be a real distortion, right? So what is humility? I mean, in the textbook the dictionary definitions, it's usually defined as a lacking of arrogance or pride, which entails being modest and unpretentious in one's behavior and attitude. And so we get this description that is it's a lacking of something else, but what does it really involve? I mean, being modest, having a sort of modesty to one's qualities, not putting on some pretentiousness. Pretension is, again, exhibiting things that maybe even we possess, but we don't flaunt them. We don't wear them on our sleeve. We don't show them off to everybody. It kind of means that we are kind of content within our own skin and our own mind. So in terms of what it looks like in this tradition, this verse that Anthony mentioned, that I think it does take a little bit of discernment to take a look at and really see what Geshe Langri Tongpa is saying here. This is the second verse of this beautiful set of verses that I'm sure most of you are familiar with, that His Holiness the Dalai Lama refers to frequently, because they really do encapsulate the heart of our practice of what's called lojong, thought transformation. So in the second verse it says, "When in the company of others, I shall always consider myself the lowest of all, and from the depths of my heart, hold others dear and supreme." Now, if you're like me, the first time you hear this verse or read this verse, or even repeated times looking at it, it kind of smarts to hear that second line, right? I shall consider myself the lowest of all. I mean, in our culture, again, we have this tendency of a lot of self-denigration, self-loathing. In fact, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, when he met with some of the teachers of Buddhism in the West for the first time, I think this conference was in the 90s or something, Venerable Tipton Chodron was there, Sharon Salzberg was there, and I think it was even Sharon Salzberg who asked this question of His Holiness. She said, "Your Holiness, in the West, we deal with so many students that are plagued by self-hatred, by self-loathing, putting themselves down, self-denigration, and this becomes very problematic. And so do you have any advice on how we work with this?" And His Holiness was flabbergasted. He just said, "What do you mean? I guess this phenomenon doesn't occur so much in Tibet." He was, in the traditional teachings, we usually identify it as the opposite thing that is going on for people. We cherish ourselves so much. We elevate ourselves so much to this higher position. And we think about me, myself, and I constantly, that the idea of putting ourselves down or thinking less of ourselves isn't really that common in the Tibetan tradition, apparently. And His Holiness even asked, of all the people in the room, he says, how many of you have experienced this yourself? And, all the hands go up. In our culture, we have a lot of that, right? Where people just don't feel so good about themselves. And you read a line like that and you get introduced to this topic of humility in that context, and you think, God, that sounds horrible. That sounds awful. I don't really want to be in that place of thinking myself the lowest of all, that I'm the dirt under everybody else's shoes. And, you know, and it gets to be tricky again, because we have to make sure that we are not distorting what that humility really means, what that idea really is that Geshe Langri Tangpa is putting across. If we see it in the context of combating that self-cherishing mind, that mind that elevates ourselves up to that more superior position, that pride is taking it one step further and thinking that, we're going to embellish that even further and think about ourselves as even greater than that. If we think about it as a target for that state of mind, which all of the thought transformation teachings are about essentially, they're about targeting that self-cherishing mind, that elevation of ourselves to most important, and they're also about, targeting the self-grasping, the ignorance that's underneath all of that we talked about earlier. So if we see that this verse is a way of getting us to combat that state of mind, to bring that down and keep it in check, then it's actually pretty wonderful advice. Because then when we walk into a room, when we're in the company of others, we actually look at it from the point of view of holding everyone else, as was said in the last two lines of that verse, to think of from the depths of our heart, hold others dear and supreme. Well, then this is the state of mind that we approach others with. This is actually what we mean by genuine humility in my thinking. Again, I don't know that, Geshe Langri Tangpa didn't say, and this is genuine humility. He's just pointing this out, that if this is what is embodied, the last two lines, then this idea of being the lowest of all is really about from the point of view of seeing that everyone else is meant to be cherished, meant to be held as very dear and supreme. And we're going to get into that, because as we look at the advantages of having humility, we see that it creates an opportunity for us to actually learn from everyone that we meet, to actually see everyone as very precious and wish fulfilling and helping us on our path. No one that we meet, no matter how despicable in words, despicable or harmful they might seem, they still have something to teach us. So this verse, I'm glad that it was brought up, because it is one of the examples in the Lojong teachings of how humility is so important. But as I said, think of that humility as the exact target to get rid of that sense of self-cherishing that's feeding our pride and so many of our other delusions. That's giving rise to this sense of me being so important. Robert Thurman, when he gave a talk in Indianapolis, this was at the opening of the Kalachakra teachings that were going to take place down the way in Bloomfield, Indiana. His Holiness was there, and I was fortunate enough to be at this talk. And when Robert Thurman got on, he says, every single one of you here today thinks that it's all about you. And this is the truth, right? We live our lives this way. This is our default mode, is that we think from the moment we get up to the moment we go to bed, it's all about us. And I'm not saying that that's exclusively what we think. We go back to that frequently. We might have things that come into our lives. Somebody calls us and they really need some help with something, or they're really distressed over whatever's happened in their life. And we go out of ourselves and we let go of that for the time being. But as soon as we're off the phone, or as soon as we, stop the helping of them, we generally default back to, okay, now what do I need? What is it that I want for my satisfaction? Again, the prideful mind is an elevation of all of that, because it looks at, the self that is being embellished and embraced in that self-cherishing mind, and thinks again that it's superior to everyone else. So it becomes a block even to the cherishing of others, the holding others dear that is in that verse. So what we're talking about in genuine humility in my mind is a mind that is able to look at others from a sense of their importance, a sense of what they have to offer to us. Not that we must once more become ourselves focused. Oh, well, what do you have to give me? That becomes a mind of attachment. That becomes a disastrous mind. But if we look at it from the point of view of we really do stand to benefit from others if we hold them in this view. If every person that I meet, I think of having something to offer to me, that I think that it's not about, you know, um, uh, me being at the center of the universe, that I actually am putting them at the center of the universe and holding them very dear because I can benefit from them. And hopefully I can benefit them in return. Well, then it's a very different state of mind. So humility, let's do some more investigation of humility. I've got some more on slides ahead, but I really kind of wanted to dig in initially by looking at that verse because once more, it can be misinterpreted, to think, oh my God, I'm just going to be, the sort of wallflower in the room, the person who nobody's paying any attention to and is totally looked down upon. It's more about adjusting our attitude towards others. And that is kind of interesting. There's a quote that's attributed to C.S. Lewis. I'll put it on the screen now. Humility is not thinking less of yourself, but thinking of yourself less. In that previous verse that I shared, that's the tendency when we hear that initially, is to think less of ourselves, to go to that place that Sharon Salzberg was talking about, to the Dalai Lama and so on. But it really means thinking of yourself less. Putting your other stuff, that's all about you and who you are and all the qualities and things that you have to offer to others and everything, and putting that to the side and thinking about others more. Again, I don't know whether this is really C.S. Lewis. I read something on the internet that seemed to deny that this was a quote from him, but nonetheless, it's a beautiful quote. I think it really embodies what we mean, again, by genuine humility. It means stop elevating yourself, puffing yourself up to that place of thinking it's all about you. Think of others, constantly thinking of others and not thinking of yourself so much. Now, to get into a deeper discussion of humility, I've borrowed from a little book that I actually found to be a real gem. I use it in a lot of different teachings. Piero Ferrucci, the book is called The Power of Kindness. He's actually a transpersonal psychologist, and the introduction is written by His Holiness. And His Holiness, I guess, has met Piero Ferrucci. It's a wonderful little book, again, that I recommend highly. It's got a bunch of different topics. It talks about service, it talks about loyalty, memory, respect, a sense of belonging, forgiveness, warmth, all these various things, and just talks about how they're all involved in the bigger picture of what it means to be kind. And so this is how, in the chapter on humility, this is how he essentially describes humility in terms of a number of statements. To know your own weaknesses and to accept them, even if it is painful. To be honest, to chase illusions away and realize how much you do not know, to treasure life's lessons. Those four statements, he says, that is humility. And humility is a great strength. It's not a weakness. Again, when we think about that line from verse 2 of the 8 verses, it makes it sound like we're being the weak one in the room. We're just going down to that lower level and getting stepped all over. No, it's actually a great strength. It actually is the strongest position that we can be with others and with ourselves. So I'm going to pick these each apart and talk a little bit about them, those four statements. The first one, to know your own weaknesses and to accept them, even if it is painful. Admittedly, it is hard for us to acknowledge our deficiencies and accept them, especially on the spiritual path. This is deep work that we're doing in Buddhism. Take it off screen for just a moment while I share a little story from Venerable Robina. Again, she's one of my main teachers, so may have heard this from her before. She actually attributed this to someone else, but I swear it's so her in and out that I just use it as a quote from her. But she says, being Buddhist doesn't mean that you're sitting there kind of all at peace, all kind of pious looking and, with this glow radiating from you as if, oh, I'm just at peace with the world. That's not what good Buddhist practice looks like, she says. Good Buddhist practice means having your hands in your own shit. I hate to use the four-letter word on a recording like this, but that's what she says, and that's really what it is. We've got our own stuff, our own crap that we need to deal with, and we need to dig our hands into it. So this very first element of humility is a hard one. It is hard to hold the mirror to ourselves. As I said, it's very easy to hold, kind of look at others and go, look at what you look like. Look at all the faults that you have. Look at your pride. But it's hard to turn the mirror back on ourselves and say, what is it that I find defective in myself, deficient in myself? Again, in our culture, this is part of what I've been talking about. The tendency that we have that when we see something that is a deficiency, that is a fault, that is something that we are lacking, that we become focused on that. That's the one person in the room that we pay attention to and disregard all the others and think that that's who we are now. We're this miserable, awful, horrible practitioner that's never going to amount to a hill of beans. Well, that's not true either. That's also a distortion. That's not being honest, as we're going to go into. That's the second element that Pierre Ferrucci talked about in regard to humility, is being honest. This is a sense of being able to admit within ourselves. We don't have to admit to the whole world. You don't need to write it on your Facebook page. Today, I realize that I'm deficient in the following ways. If you want to, feel free to. But nonetheless, I don't think that's really the most beneficial way to, work with this. But at least admit to ourselves and say, admittedly, I need to do more in this regard, in that regard. I need to do deeper study on this. I need to, look at these practices. And you do it, of course, with that overriding motivation. It's because you want to be a benefit to others and you want to develop yourself to do that. So if we keep it all in that vein of what our traditional motivations and what have you, looking at our faults is actually one of the most helpful things we can do. So let's go back to the slides and continue this investigation. This is all still on that same first point, to know our own weaknesses and to accept them. The last bullet point on this page, if we deny our faults, though, we are missing a valuable opportunity to grow and develop. Right? This happens sometimes, right? When people aren't willing to look at those, the crap in our minds, we aren't willing to go there, is because if we don't see those things, if we aren't aware of those things, we're going to miss the opportunity to actually grow from that. The things that are in our lives that we can examine and say, wow, I really am pretty quick with my temper and say things, that I shouldn't have said. I need to work on that. If instead we deny our faults, we don't, we think, oh, I'm a perfectly fine person. I'm no different than anyone else. We have that sense of pride in ourselves that is negligent of these faults and behaviors that we're engaging in that are not so helpful. Then we'll never work on those. We're going to be blind to those. We're just going to continue thinking there's nothing wrong with me. I'm okay. You're okay. And we'll just live our lives from that point of view. Again, if we go to the place of acknowledging our weaknesses and our faults, then we will grow and develop from those. With awareness and acceptance of our own imperfections, we also can then be more secure and at ease with ourselves and also with others. I mean, look at how when we're coming from a place of pride, as I mentioned earlier, we get very competitive and judgmental of others. Instead, we can be with them and be quite comfortable acknowledging our own faults. And if somebody says something to us that is, pointing out that fault, we will be secure with that. We won't be getting all prideful and thinking, oh, what are you talking about? I don't have that fault at all. We'll be totally at ease with it. We won't cause conflict with others. Also, with humility, we can make do with what we have in our lives, becoming more serene and joyful. Of course, this is why humility is brought up in the 8 Pillars of Joy in the Book of Joy that I quoted a little bit from earlier, is because it is a source of joy for us to be in that place of humility, to be content at a deeper level. Again, not that we become complacent. That once more is a problem if we go to that place of thinking everything is just fine, but we don't, do the deeper work. We have to be aware again of the faults and deficiencies and work on those. But we can do that with a very serene and joyful mind. One as a little footnote to all of this before we get into the next one of being honest, is that humility, as they point out in the Book of Joy, comes from the same root word that humanity comes from, that humor comes from. It's the word humus in the Latin, which means earth, soil, ground. It's an interesting word, right? Because humility is kind of like being back on the ground, whereas the puffed up, inflated sense of self that rises up above all of it is out of touch with that. We need to be kind of right back on the ground with everyone else. And that's where humanity is. That's where we kind of see our common, our shared humanity. We don't think of ourselves as being more than that. We don't need to. We are quite comfortable being on the ground with everyone else. And then they, of course, point out how that also becomes a source of humor when we can look at our shared humanity. And it's always good to introduce humor in terms of how we are working with these concepts in our spiritual path. But humility, again, has that same aspect to it that these other words do, of kind of being grounded, being back on earth rather than up in the sky. And of course, that also entails then being honest. The second quality that Piero Ferrucci identified. He says we can gain freedom from the roles and the inflated ego that comes with the false image we often have of ourselves. He does talk about this in the book, how sometimes there's no substance, there's just an image. There's just an idea of who we are that we are projecting to other people. Sometimes even our Facebook identities become like that, right? Based on the things that we post and the things that we choose, our interests and what have you. We kind of put forward an image of who we are. But is that really honest? Is that really embodying all of it? Now, again, I'm not so worried about Facebook pages, but I'm worried about, how are we with others? If we are genuinely okay with acknowledging our faults and not elevating ourselves with this prideful state of mind, then we don't have to be so attached to our roles and to this sense of who we are in the world. This is why pride in particular is always set out as something that we have to keep in check in our Dharma practice, especially if we become teachers. This is something that I have to be constantly aware of and attentive to, and I don't always do the best job. But nonetheless, to see that the role that one plays often in terms of being a teacher is one that does acknowledge that there's some greater understanding. I don't want to use the word superior understanding. That would be, kind of dangerous territory. But something that I'm offering to you that I have that I could, be a benefit to you. So it already implies some level of more on one side, less on the other side. And you have to make sure that that doesn't veer into a prideful state of mind. So once more, see that we have to be honest within that. That's why frequently when I'm teaching, I'm admitting my own faults and admitting my own deficiencies in terms of the path, which are great, which are many. So we each have to once more keep that in check and not so strongly identify with that role. Because the other thing that happens, if any of you are teachers as well in whatever capacity, and all of us are teachers of the Dharma in some capacity in terms of how we relate to others in our lives from that vantage point. But once we take on this role and identify with it so strongly as being teacher, well, then we become blind to being a student at that time. And this is an important dimension to our spiritual path, is that we are always both. His Holiness the Dalai Lama talks about how even at when he wrote the Book of Joy, it was around 80 when all of that took place. He said even at 80 years old, he feels like he's still a student. Now that's what genuine humility again looks like, is that sort of honesty that we are admitting where we do lack certain qualities and abilities still. And we're okay with that. We can let go of some sort of role or image that we have of ourselves and not identify with that in a distorted way. And then, of course, without that pretension, our relationships with others will embody trust and connection. If we're always honest with others, if when somebody points out a fault to us, we are willing to admit to that, we are willing to take responsibility for that, to make amends for that, to forgive others for their faults, to seek forgiveness from them. All of those are how humility gets embodied. When we are honest, we are willing to kind of be with ourselves in that deeper way. The next slide has one more point about being honest, and by stopping the judging and competing mind, we can actually be more creative and efficient in all our endeavors. Piero Ferrucci points this out. Kind of the idea is if we put all this energy when we are with others, especially in group interactions, when we're trying to accomplish something as a team or a department or whatever the case might be in your work, or as a family or household, if we're always in that judging and competing mind, you're wasting so much energy. You could actually be much more creative and efficient in everything that you're doing, because the mind won't be entertaining all of those thoughts. It'll be more about how do I do the task most efficiently, and how do I make sure that I'm doing it with ways that will help expand people's involvement and imagination, and the results be even better. The third element that was involved in being honest was the idea of to chase illusions away, illusions of thinking that we know so much, and realize how much we actually don't know. This we've already touched on, throughout the talk today, but nonetheless, I want to point out a few things on this. Every encounter with another being has something to teach us if we're open to the lesson. And I can't help but emphasize that enough, or too much. The idea is that everybody we meet has something to teach us, something that we can learn from them. And if we go into with that, again, not that we become I-centered, like I said before, that it's all about what can they teach me and what can they give me. It's putting them first, holding them dear, and thinking, what can this person teach me about myself and about others so I can be of greater benefit to others? In the Zen tradition, they use this term beginner's mind, and they talk about how there are infinite possibilities to the beginner's mind, but in the mind of an expert, only few. I mean, even look at when you approach teachings, and I'm sure you do have teachings sometimes there, or teachings you see online, and it gets advertised, and you see, oh, this is a topic I've studied before. I don't need to go to that teaching. And so we somehow think that there isn't something more that we could learn about that we somehow have already got it. Well, again, that's a form of delusion. We still can learn something about it. They often say that going back to teachings you've heard before, even to go back to notes you took from a teaching you did before, is really useful, because there are some things you may not have integrated so well from that you heard but you didn't really assimilate. The Dharma is meant to be a continual process of absorbing teachings again and again and again. In fact, the role of a Dharma teacher is to say the same thing again and again and again, regardless of whether people have heard it before or whether they think, that they know it already. Everyone needs to learn this. And, the value, of course, of me being a teacher for myself is that I get to say it again and again, so I become more familiar with it again and again and again, and hopefully begin to integrate it into my life. But we have to be open to that reality that, everything can enhance our own learning. If we have a beginner's mind, if we go into it with the idea that this is something I can actually learn from, even if I've heard those teachings before, then we'll hear many, many more things within that teaching. But if we think we're an expert on that already, all we'll be doing is judging and criticizing what the teacher's saying, how they're presenting it, what they aren't saying perhaps that they should be saying. I mean, it's a really ridiculous mind. And there's a quote from Piero Ferrucci in regard to this. He says, "We have the choice to recognize that all around us are people who, with their experiences, their feelings and ideas, their dreams and ideals, can enrich our lives. We need only look and listen. We need the courage to ask ourselves, what can I learn from this person?" So again, it's not an egocentric point of view. It's really holding others dear and supreme, as we saw earlier in that verse from Geshe Langri Tangpa. It's thinking about these beings have something that is amazing about them. His Holiness talks about how every person he meets, he feels like there's something wonderful there that he wants to know. He wants to be, to get to know who that person is. I mean, what a wonderful way to go about one's life. This is really what genuine humility looks like. The fourth little aspect that was on Piero Ferrucci's list is to treasure life's lessons. Well, this is kind of a continuation of what we saw about learning from others and so on. But with humility, we can appreciate how much others have to offer to us. This is kind of this deeper sense of appreciation or gratitude that arises, a gratefulness, because everyone does have something to teach us. Therefore, as I said in the second bullet point, we can also be grateful for each person and respond to the gifts that they provide us with kindness in return. That's why it's emphasized in this book as an aspect of kindness, the power of kindness that Piero Ferrucci wrote, is because it contributes to our kindness to others. If we see others through the lens of gratitude for what they have to offer to us and see them as very precious in that way, giving us valuable life lessons, well then we want to be kind to them. We want to treat them in that reciprocal way, doing what we can for them. Let's go on then to the last little bit. I'm going to give you a few suggestions about how to develop genuine humility, some of which you've, no doubt heard before, but I think it is good to accentuate these. The first one is seeing the disadvantages of pride. Initially, as we were doing, a little bit at the beginning in the meditation, we must honestly examine our own pride and develop some wish to overcome it by seeing its faults. With almost every one of the delusions, they say that the initial step that we need to engage in is to see the disadvantages of that. What are the disadvantages of following the mind of attachment? Well, that it makes us into kind of like vampires. We just keep craving more and more and more, and we are never satisfied. And it can ruin, a lot of things in our lives by virtue of that pattern of attachment. We even see how attachment gets really unhealthy when it becomes addiction, and when people live their lives from that place. That's how we examine attachment, and that's already very powerful to see the disadvantages of that. With pride, we need to see the disadvantages so that we begin to move in the direction of humility. If we see there's nothing wrong with that, or if we aren't even recognizing our own pride, we're not going to make the very first step. So again, these are important things that are the starting point usually. Oftentimes in the traditional Tibetan Buddhist teachings, as many of you know from the Lam Rim, the stages of the path, they often do that little kind of advertising at the beginning. It's the publicity before they get into the topic. They say, well, okay, we're going to talk about death and impermanence. The great benefits of being aware of death and impermanence are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And the great disadvantages of being, kind of ignoring that are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So they kind of put the publicity up front. Well, that's kind of what we need to do initially with our studies often, is we need to see that this is a harmful state of mind. Again, what we were talking about earlier in delineating kind of if pride has something, some positive qualities, well, there is a sense of self-confidence and self-esteem that is good to develop based on our own acknowledgement of the things that we have learned, the things that we are able to do, the accomplishments that we've made, but not to, again, puff that all up and make it afflicted and distorted, but rather to use that as a source of feeding into our humility that sees that there is still a lot more to learn. There are still many other people that can help us on our path and help us to develop. So this is the idea behind this first step, is to make sure that we are really honest with ourselves in terms of our own pride, and then see the disadvantages of it. Then this is the more traditional one that's talked about usually in the Lam Rim text, the stages of the path text, realizing our own situation more accurately. In the traditional teachings, the main antidote to pride in our spiritual practice is to contemplate all the things we don't know and how we still haven't achieved any real freedom from suffering. One of the texts they say that's really humbling, that you can actually, kind of study and realize how little you know. And trust me, it does work, because we studied it in the master's program, is the text that's called Abhidharmakosha. It's actually the root of these low-rick teachings, the mind's, the various mental factors, the afflictions, and so on. All of that is set out, but it's encyclopedic. This text goes into so much information about the world in a variety of ways that it's huge. I mean, you're very humbling. It was my least favorite subject to study. Perhaps it's indicative of my pride, but it's really kind of gets you in there and forces you to learn things that show how much you really don't know. But it's also the idea that, we're still in samsara. We're still under the control of our delusions. We're still dealing with suffering. We haven't achieved any great freedom yet, so who are we to be so prideful? There's a verse from Nagarjuna's letter to a friend. This book, this is one translation of it. There are a couple of translations out there. It's verse 46. I'm not beyond my karma, the deeds I've done. I'll still fall ill, age, die, and leave my friends. Think like this again and yet again. And with this remedy, avoid all arrogance. So if we think about the fact that, I'm not such, amazing stuff because I haven't achieved any of these great things yet. I'm still not free from my own karma, my actions. I'm still under the control of these factors and have to experience illness and aging, and will eventually have to die, leaving behind everything I have. I mean, I haven't achieved any transcendence, any freedom from all of that. So who am I to be so, prideful? Again, watch that this doesn't sink down into the despair and the self-denigration that can happen sometimes in our culture and in our own minds. And each of us has to be intimate with that as well and know when that's starting to arise. This verse by Nagarjuna isn't meant to say that you should, just kind of recognize your own faults and then just live with that. It's saying actually acknowledge those, use that to overcome your pride, and then continue to do the work. Do it with a joyful mind, with a happy mind, not a prideful one. A third technique for working with cultivating humility is to reflect on interdependence and mutual support. And Piero Ferrucci even points this out again. He's got some Buddhist leanings, I assume, based on this statement he makes. He says one way that humility can be embodied is by thinking, I am not the only one. Other people exist. You know, the whole teaching on generating humility as, the counterforce to pride is one that embraces the concept of interdependence, that none of us stands alone, that we like to think that we're totally self-sufficient. And of course, these times are giving us this lesson again and again and again. Remember when this all started, some months ago, and I mean, everyone was going out to the stores and buying up all the groceries and the toilet paper and everything, and people were like being really quite self-centered in some ways. I'm not saying everyone was by doing that, because some people had a lot of people that they were trying to assure that they had things for and what have you, but people were falling into that default mode. And then, of course, we came to realize how much we do depend upon others to put those things on the shelf, to produce the food that we eat, to make the toilet paper that we use, and so on. We can't live sort of independent of all those people, no matter how much you buy in terms of food, how full your cart is when you went out, to do that initial shopping. It's not going to last forever. We need others. And of course, especially on the spiritual path, we need others. Others, once more, become mirrors for us, become ways of helping us to develop various qualities and keep pushing the envelope and moving beyond where we are. If we don't have others in our lives, we can't practice morality, we can't practice patience, we can't practice so many other things that are useful to our spiritual development. So this pride that thinks that, oh, I've got it all and I can take care of myself and I'm perfectly fine and everyone else is kind of down there in the depths, is totally distorted. It is not looking at the truth of interdependence at all. In fact, interdependence is one of the main things they highlight in the Book of Joy on their little chapter on humility as well, is because humility embraces the idea that we're all in this together. How many times have we heard that through this pandemic, right? But how true is it? It's absolute truth. It is the way that everything has always worked, even in early days when there weren't so many people around or what have you, and nations weren't, developed and all of this other stuff. You still depended upon others. You still depend upon others for the things that you have in your life, for the kindness that they show you, and so on. And of course, on the spiritual path, we see that we depend upon others for everything that we develop. We even need those difficult people in our lives to develop patience, to develop a sense of a deeper compassion and love for others that gets challenged by those difficult people. So we need absolutely everyone and everything in our lives, and we become blind to that if we're prideful. A simple reflection on how all the things you have, even your knowledge, how all those depend upon others, will aid in seeing this truth with humility. And it will also hopefully induce a sense of gratitude, as we saw earlier. But this idea that we are mutually supporting others and then we are mutually supported by others. There is no such thing as a self-sufficient person, completely removed from everyone else. A fourth thing, of course, is to eventually adopt attitudes like we saw in that verse from Geshe Langri Tangpa, to cherish others and serve them. When we recognize interdependence deeply, the tendency to put ourselves first will gradually diminish and we will embrace cherishing others. This will be a natural outcropping, hopefully, of seeing that we are dependent upon others. We should be cherishing the folks that are out in the fields picking the summer fruit and everything so that it doesn't rot on the tree or the vine and we can have it in our stores and what have you. Those are valuable beings. I mean, that's another thing that's come about through this pandemic, is seeing not just how much we depend upon each other, but how much especially we depend upon a lot of people who are these essential workers who are doing everything that needs to be done for our purposes, for keeping us alive, for keeping us comfortable. Well, we should be cherishing those beings, holding them very dear. In addition, if we incorporate an attitude of being of benefit and service to others in our lives, that will assure that our humility strengthens. It's very humbling. I'm sure every one of you has done volunteer work in some capacity, where you've gone to a homeless shelter to serve meals, or you've been, I had the good fortune of doing some hospice volunteer work in the 90s and early 90s and late 80s in San Francisco. Very humbling work, right? You come in and you are really about the other person, about the people you are serving in that setting, because your needs don't matter at all. It's about fulfilling theirs in that environment. So again, those ways of being of service are ways to help us to cultivate that humility, to think that we exist to help others, to serve others, to be a benefit to others. It's kind of interesting. His Holiness always points out, and another little antidote to that tendency that we have to think, oh, I don't want to go to that place of thinking I'm the lowest of all or whatever, is to think that this is actually how your needs are met. He says, if you want to be selfish, be wisely selfish. How are we wisely selfish? We take care of others. We serve them. We cherish them. And your needs are met by virtue of that. Through the good karma you create by tending to them, you are tended to. Through just the mindset that is about benefiting others, helping them, we eventually accomplish everything that we desire. And that's what the whole spiritual path is. It's a development of our own minds to the greatest degree so that we have our potential met by meeting the needs of others. It's the sort of paradox of the spiritual path. I just have one or two more things. I know we're at the end of class time-wise, but an additional practice to counter our prideful focus on ourselves is rejoicing. Rejoicing in the good qualities and accomplishments of others. Because that's the exact opposite of judging others, being critical of others. If someone even has one small quality, rejoice in it. Look at them and say, how amazing, how wonderful that you've developed that good quality, that good fortune in your life. And then that's it. Wow, I thought I had one more. Okay, get another pink blast there at the end. Any final questions or comments from anybody? Again, you're welcome to unmute your mic if you wanted to say something. Anyone? So I hope this was useful. Again, just to look at a short review, we kind of looked at pride and got to know what this little critter is like, so that we can have some better identification of it within our own minds and see the faults of it, and then begin to look at what humility embodies, and what sorts of ideas feed into that, and then of course some practices that we can actually do. And if anybody again wants a copy of these slides, I'm happy to make them available. I think Rebecca will be happy to help out with that. I will send those on to her in the form of like a PDF file, and she can get those to people. So any final questions or comments? Yes, Jack has one. Yes? Do you have one? Oh, no, okay. Good. Well, thank you all for your comments. I agree that this is a powerful topic. I think it is one that's not talked about so much. Again, we do see it because it's one of these six root afflictions, sometimes at the end of some sections of the Lam Rim, particularly like Geshe Sopa's, his commentary at the end of the middle scope, where we talk about combating the delusions. He goes into, but it's only like a page, maybe a full page of instruction on how to work with pride. And it's the very traditional approach. But pride is very insidious, it kind of gets in there, and it really does have a kind of nasty effect on our relationships with others, and of course does harm to ourselves in the process. So anyway, I'm grateful for all of your comments and glad that you found this useful. Let's do just the prayers that we did these last week, and I think Venerable Tendran does these frequently, is the dedication prayers using Master Shantideva's verses from the Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life. So before we recite this, bring to mind those specific beings that you want to dedicate for, those beings that you are aware of or know, that you're holding in your heart, that are experiencing obstacles or illness, that are dying or who have died, and think that you're dedicating for them specifically so they can be free from their suffering and have all the causes that will lead them to perfect peace and happiness. But also, of course, we think about all beings, because every being that is still within samsara, still unenlightened, is suffering to some degree, is not dealing with a favorable state. So let's recite these verses with all those beings in mind. May all beings everywhere, plagued by sufferings of body and mind, obtain an ocean of happiness and joy by virtue of our merits. May no living creature suffer, commit evil, or ever fall ill. May no one be afraid or belittled with a mind weighed down by depression. May the blind see forms and the deaf hear sounds. May those whose bodies are worn with toil be restored on finding repose. May the naked find clothing, the hungry find food. May the thirsty find water and delicious drinks. May the poor find wealth, those weak with sorrow find joy. May the forlorn find hope, constant happiness, and prosperity. May there be timely rains and bountiful harvests. May all medicines be effective and wholesome prayers bear fruit. May all who are sick and ill quickly be freed from their ailments. Whatever diseases there are in the world, may they never occur again. May the frightened cease to be afraid, and those bound be freed. May the powerless find power, and may people think of benefiting each other. For as long as space exists, for as long as sentient beings remain, until then may we too abide to dispel the misery of the world. Let's recite these two prayers for our precious teachers, His Holiness and Lama Zopa. As we recite these, we can think about all the spiritual guides that exist in this world, wherever, that are helping sentient beings. May they all have good health and long lives through these prayers. The wish-granting, wish-fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world, to the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. You who uphold the subduer's moral way, who serve as the bountiful bearer of all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Manjunath's victorious doctrine, who masterfully accomplish magnificent prayers honoring the three jewels, Savior of myself and others, your disciples, please, please live long. So one thing I might mention before we conclude, and maybe Nicole or Rebecca were going to mention as well, this Friday is a very auspicious day in the Buddhist calendar. We had Sakadawa at the beginning of June. That was the Buddha's enlightenment. 49 days after the Buddha was enlightened, he taught the Dharma for the first time, the first wheel turning, where he taught the Four Noble Truths. So I've offered to do a Shakyamuni Buddha Puja on that day, which I will believe will be at 7 o'clock till about 8:30, maybe even and a little bit earlier. So it's a good day for engaging in any type of spiritual practices. I noticed that I think the IMI, the monastic part of our organization, is sponsoring a Heart Sutrathon where people are reciting the Heart Sutra. But you can recite sutras that day, do prostrations that day, take precepts that day if you're familiar with the 8 Mahayana precepts. But it's a wonderful day also to come together in our virtual Gampa and do some practice together. So I'll be leading that from 7 to 8:30 on Friday night. So, okay. And then I don't.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for reminding us about that. And also, too, we'll have the practice day karma Saturday from 10 a.m. to 4. You're welcome to join for the whole thing or the morning or afternoon. And also, if anyone is interested in staying after and coming back at this link at 1 o'clock for a discussion group, if you want to have a little lunch, then you're welcome to do that. And also, we are looking for a few volunteers for some help with some things needed, computer skills. So if you're interested in helping with that, please email me. Thank you so much, Don, and for everyone coming.
You're welcome.